Hello, and welcome to our, thank you. Welcome to our session. I'm Pete Werman. I'm the director of Sony AI America, and I was also the project lead for the work we did to create GT Sophy, a racing agent for the game Gran Turismo. And today I'm going to give you some background on the project and also explain some of the technologies that went into it. And hopefully you'll come away with a greater appreciation for what we accomplished and look forward to what we can do for video games like this in the future. First, a little background on Sony AI. Sony AI was established in April of 2020, and we have offices in Tokyo and Zurich, and we have a distributed workforce in North America. Most of those people report to me. And there's a lot more information on our website. We have several flagship projects, one on gaming, which is the team that I run, another large project on imaging and sensing, another project on gastronomy, and kind of holding it all together are our core flagship projects around AI ethics. The particular project that I'm describing was a collaborative effort between Sony AI, Polyphony Digital, who makes the game Gran Turismo, and you've heard a lot about them today, and also Sony Interactive Entertainment, who provided access to a lot of PlayStations in the cloud so that we could train the agents to perform in this game. If you don't know much about Gran Turismo, it's this very high-fidelity, real driving simulator that faithfully recreates the experience of driving on a large number of tracks, many of them real tracks from around the world, with hundreds of different kinds of cars, from low-end cars, Yugos, and cars you could buy for a few $1,000s, all the way up to high-end racing cars and Formula One cars. It's very realistic, has a lot of highly accurate models of the physics of race cars, and tracks, and temperature, and weather, and all of those kinds of things. And it's been used. There's a very robust esports environment built around it, and it's been used by professional drivers for training, and also was the foundation for one of the events in the 2022 Virtual Olympics. Okay, our grand challenge in this environment was to recreate the experience that top drivers have when racing each other. This is from the 2019 World Championship with the esports drivers. And if you watch closely, not only does it look a lot like a real racing event, the actual skill of the drivers is fantastic. They're wheel-to-wheel, driving very closely at high speeds, performing these very expert maneuvers, and providing very exciting racing situations to each other. So we wanted to be able to compete with these kinds of drivers. The goal was to beat 4 of the top drivers in the world. Due to the pandemic, we were limited to finding top drivers in Japan, but fortunately we had some of the recent world champions available to us in a head-to-head race on 3 different tracks with 3 different kinds of cars. Dragon Trail Seaside was the first car using this Mercedes, and then Lago Maggiore was on the second race using the Porsche 911 GR3 car, and then the grand finale was on Cirque du Sarthe, which is where the 24 Hours of Le Mans is held, and using the Red Bull 2019 competition car. So how did we go about tackling this problem? First, we identified the core skills that our agent had to have. And we broke that down into 3 categories. First is race car control. The agent had to be able to control this car at very high speeds at the limits of traction in order to get the best time to be able to compete with these best drivers. Then it had to perform actual racing tactics. It had to know when it could pass, when to defend, what maneuvers to take in order to try to get ahead in the race. And finally, it had to respect the rules of racing etiquette, which are essential for fair play and are kind of loosely written down. Everyone kind of abides by them, but there's actually a lot of ambiguity in these rules. The tool that we used to accomplish this was called reinforcement learning, and it's a well-known tool within the AI research community. The idea is there's an agent embedded in the world. The agent takes actions. The world changes. In this case, it turns the steering wheel. The car changes a little bit. Its position in the world changes. And then it sees a new state of the world. It sometimes gets a reward of some kind. It says that was good or that was bad. and then it iterates on this loop over and over again. And through experience and neural network training, it eventually learns to perform very efficiently and effectively in this environment. So when we talk about reinforcement learning, we have to identify 3 key topics. What actions can the agent take in the world? What rewards does it get for those actions and those state transitions? And then what can it see about the world? The actions in this case are actually pretty straightforward because the agent can either step on the gas or hit the brake, and it can turn the steering wheel left and right. It didn't have access to some of the more advanced features in the cars. It couldn't manually change the gears, couldn't turn on traction control, things like that. But it had these 2 basic actions. And its basic, most important reward was how far along the course had it progressed. We basically map its position to the center line, and we measure how far along that center line the car's gone. And if you're going faster, you get a bigger reward, and that encourages the agent to learn to drive fast. Of course, if you're going too fast and you go off course, then you get a negative reward, and that propagates back, and the agent learns to drive at just the right speed to stay on the track and go as fast as possible. It also gets penalties for if its tires are slipping, if it goes off course with more than 2 tires, or if it hits a wall or some other obstacle. Now, what could the car see? That's a little more complicated. It had access to information about its car state. So it knew its speed, its angles of rotation, and its acceleration zone in those directions. It knew the tire loads, and it knew its position relative to the center line, whether it's to the left or to the right of the course. So it had access to a few of these features of the car and its position on the track. Importantly, it also had a little visibility into what's ahead of it. So if you look at these purple dots that are propagating as the car drives down the track, it sees about 40 points on either side of the edge, all spread out equidistantly, based upon the car's current speed. So as the car slows down in this corner here, you see the visible region contracts because it's going slower, and it's getting about 2 or 3 seconds worth of visibility at its current speed of where the track's going. And this information allows it to plan, in an abstract sense, to plan what it's going to do and where it has to be on the course. For computing infrastructure, we took advantage of Sony Interactive Entertainment's PlayStation in the Cloud network, and they have thousands of PlayStations that are available for humans to play PlayStation games online. When humans aren't using those, we can use those to train our agents. And so we set up a system with them that allowed us to stand up experiments in their environment. We would configure it. We'd send the code over there. It would run for a few days. We'd get data back, and we'd evaluate that and iterate. It typically takes us 20 PlayStations and 2 weeks to train an agent for a particular course, which on the whole, compared to a lot of these big neural deep learning kinds of projects, is not really that much compute overall. We did develop an enhancement to a standard RL algorithm called soft actor critic. Our version we call QRSAC, because it added some distributional learning on top of soft actor critic. And we did find that actually made a significant difference in how fast the agent turned out to be. So the first thing you have to do to be able to race against the top drivers is be as fast as them. So in order to benchmark ourselves against them, Polyphony collected data from online races where they had players around the world compete in time trial events with the exact same car and track that we were going to use in these competitions. And then each player's best ever lap time is recorded as one data point in this histogram. And for, I think, Maggiore, there's 12,000 players who recorded a best lap time. And this shows us the distribution of their lap times, their individual best lap times on that course with the Mercedes, the Porsche. And so, it's a pretty long tail. There's mediocre players like me who are way out in the 20s. But the top players in the world are hitting around the 115 seconds time. So the first thing we had to do is become as fast as them. And so we did tests and through our training, got better and better. this little graph gives you a sense for how fast GT Sophy is compared to the best players. The orange bars inside the box is a histogram of 100 laps that GT Sophy took on this track. And the blue circles are the top 5 human times. And so you can see almost all of GT Sophy's lap times are better than all but one of the human players' times. This particular human player's name is Valerio Gallo. He's one of the world champions, and he's the guy who won the Virtual Olympics. He's also the only player who had raced against GT Sophy when before this data was collected, so he had some idea how fast you could really get on this track. This is the only track where any of the humans even intersected with GT Sophy's distribution. So you can see the agent's very reliably as fast as the best humans in the world. This is the third race was on Cirque de la Sarthe. And it's interesting to look at exactly what it is that GT Sophy does that makes it faster than the best humans. In this case, the person who was doing the test against GT Sophy is Igor Fraga. Like Jan Mardenborough, he's a GT player who's made the transition to real race cars. And he's currently driving in one of the Super Formula leagues in Japan. And this graph shows how far behind he is from GT Sophy. If you look at the top, staying perfectly on top would be exactly on pace with GT Sophy. And each time he falls behind a little bit, it's because there's something that happened where GT Sophy did better. In the end, he's almost over 1.5 seconds behind the agent on this track. And it turns out all of these regions where he lost 1/10 of a second or 1/4 of a second are all the hard corners on the track. And there's something about what GT Sophy's doing that allows it to come out of those corners faster and maintain more speed, and therefore beat the best drivers in time trial situations. This is the way these racers experienced the time trial event. The ghost that you can see there is a ghost of GT Sophy's best lap, or one of its laps, not a particularly best lap. And this is Igor Fraga's view, trying to chase the ghost of GT Sophy down this track.
Man, that's fast. That's really fast. Like, I really want to watch the onboard as well to see how like they throttle and braking trace, steering trace as well. It work, because it's definitely something else.
So that's what it's like to be the best driver in the world, trailing a second behind an AI agent. So there's always a question when you do stuff like this: is this really a fair comparison to what the humans have to do? And it's impossible to make it perfectly fair, but we provide, in the paper we wrote, a comparison of some of the pros and cons that each of the competitors has. The humans see a lot more information about the track. They can see the curbs and the walls. They have mini-maps and other stuff. But the agent can see much more precise information about the things that it does see. So it gets those points along the edge that are pretty accurate and knows its speed down to a much finer level of detail, etc. So if you're interested, we can talk. I can answer questions about this later. But overall, we decided it's about as fair as we can make it. And most importantly, the cars are exactly the same. Okay? So there's no cheating going on in the sense of giving the car more weight or more friction or any of that. It's exactly the same car behavior that the humans are driving. Now, of course, being faster than the best humans isn't enough, because you actually have to race. And you have to learn to do these other two things really well, which is quite hard. OK, so we'll dive into tactics a little bit. Or before we do that, first we have to talk about what the agent can see from the other cars. In this case, the representation is pretty simple. If our agent is the burgundy car in the middle here, it just has a list of the cars in front of it and the cars behind it, and it knows their position and their relative velocities. It thinks of them as a point, so it doesn't actually know anything about the geometry of the cars. But by practicing against them, it learns that if the two center of masses are this far apart, if they get too close, they're going to collide, and it learns to adjust its position based on that. And now we added a reward to encourage the agent to try to pass other cars. And this was a simple symmetric reward. When the agent gets closer to a car in front of it, it gets a bonus. And if it starts to fall back from the car in front of it, it gets a small penalty. And it gets the same amount per distance in both situations. But by passing cars in front of it, it's able to accumulate this reward, and that encourages it to learn to pass. Now, to learn to actually drive in traffic, it's a lot more complicated than just driving alone on the track. So we set up situations where the agent drives in different parts of the track. We'd started off in these different configurations where there was like one agent, maybe all by itself, all spread around, all 20 all around the track, or in small groups of 1, 2, 3, 4, or 7. And we'd put those in different parts and just launch the agents in those positions. And through that experience, those configurations, it got a lot of experience for a lot of different kinds of situations. But that wasn't really enough, because there's these very key moments that happen in races that don't happen very often, but you have to learn to handle them and take advantage of them if you want to be able to race against the best drivers. For example, if you find yourself right behind another car on a straightaway, you can use a slipstream to get some extra speed and then pass the car in front of you. And sometimes you come into corners and there's the opportunity to do something like a crossover pass, where you start on the outside and you take a sharper turn, come back on the inside, and you're able to execute a pass. So to encourage these kinds of skills to be developed, we also configured the agent to set it up in scenarios on these very particular parts of the track where we knew it was either very complicated to learn, or there were going to be opportunities, and we wanted to make sure the agent was prepared to take advantage of them. So here's an example of the agent having learned the slipstream skill.
This is one of the best overtaking opportunities, because of course you've got the advantage of the slipstream, but you need to do it on the straight. You can't do it going into the braking zone, because there isn't one. And you can see that Orange knows that, goes towards the outside line, and is ahead then of Tomoaki Yamanaka as they come in towards Indianapolis. So it's the
So that's a little hard to follow. I should have mentioned the AI cars are the brightly colored cars, and the humans are all in white cars in these videos. But in that situation, GT Sophy Orange was able to get behind Yamanaka, use the slipstream to get a little extra speed, and actually executed that pass on that straightaway. The other two tracks had similar situations, and we set up special training scenarios for those particular kinds of corners to make sure the agents in those races were able to execute those maneuvers. This is an example of the agent having learned to defend. So again, the two cars in front, the purple and green one, are GT Sophy cars, and the 4 humans are directly behind those 2 cars in this case. And you'll see the green car move over to protect the inside.
Certainly proved to be a tougher challenge than I should imagine that they were thinking. Emerald goes defensive then. Miyazono tries to get the switch back on the inside. No opportunity presents itself through turn 3 then.
So this is clearly not an agent just following a line and doing what it was programmed to do. It's sensitive to the situation, and it took the inside, I won't say intentionally, but it had learned that protecting the inside was a better thing to do, and so it executed that maneuver. This is a more complicated example, which Katano-san showed this morning. I'll explain it a little more now. So we're going to watch later in that same race, the gray and the green car are battling it out with the humans here. And while we run this video of the actual event, on the right side, we have the trajectories of the cars as they go through this maneuver. And the dotted line, the red dotted line for reference, is the path that GT Sophy would take if it was alone. So you'll see how different these trajectories are as these cars are battling against the humans and responding to the actual conditions.
Once again, a defensive move there from Emerald, but losing 2, losing 3 positions there for Emerald. Oh, and contact there as well, as I think Miyazono got a bit of a hit from Grease. Grease goes up into P5. Here comes Emerald on the outside.
So maybe there was a little bump there, maybe not. There was no penalty called. There's a lot of that. That happens in real racing too with humans, so that was very realistic. But you'll see that the two Sophy cars, GT Sophy cars, were able to come out of that corner both passing two humans. And it's not like we planned and trained for that specific scenario, but the agent through the process was able to learn a pretty robust policy. Okay, so we have an agent that's very fast, and we have one that has learned tactical skills, but we also have to be a good sport. And so somehow the agent had to respect the rules of etiquette of racing. These rules are written down in human language, not written down in programming language. And so I highlighted, I think this is the FIA guidelines, I highlighted the words that are extremely subjective when evaluating a racing scenario, or what they call an incident. So when something questionable happens in a race, the stewards, who are the judges, review the video, they look at what happened, and then they make a decision about whether any of the drivers deserve a penalty. And you might get a penalty if you caused an avoidable collision, if you forced a driver off the track, if you illegitimately prevented an overtaking maneuver or illegitimately impeded another driver. Words like illegitimately are very vague, for computer scientists especially. And so we had to somehow turn this into rewards and penalties that we could give to the agent to try to encourage behavior that was consistent with this without being able to program these rules directly. And it's even more complicated than that because the stewards actually look at the impact of the incident. It's not just, was there a bump, but did that bump cause harm or give someone an advantage? So it's a very, very fine balance between being aggressive enough to execute passes and stuff while not being a bad sport. This is an example where Sophy is just a little too timid and gives away a position it didn't have to.
And it's going to make things very interesting in terms of the overall point standings then here as well. We come through our nose. That was the last real overtaking opportunity then for Sophy Orange. But is Yamanaka going to try and invent something down into the Porsche curves? You bet he is. What a move then from Tomoaki Yamanaka to get it ahead. Orange runs it a bit wide.
So it was a great move by Yamanaka, but when we looked at it later, it was a bad move by GT Sophy. And GT Sophy just gave away a position and a driving line that it didn't have to give away. On the other hand, it's also really easy to be too aggressive. This is a little video where you'll see Orange with a very small bump on another car, but at that position and moment, it ends up causing a problem, and that deserves a penalty.
When these guys need to be working together really at this stage, because look at Orange really close onto the back. Was there a bit of contact into the left-hander? I think there was. Cockerman pushed onto the gravel.
So just a small amount of contact causes him to slide a little too wide, Cockerman to slide a little too wide, and then he goes off the course. And GT Sophy deserved and received a penalty for that small bump in that case. So it's a very, very fine line that we're trying to balance here. To try to encourage the right behavior, we gave our leverage, our training mechanism requires that we give rewards and penalties to the agent for different situations. We can't recreate all these situations, so we have to do it in a way that's general and hopefully trains the agent to be respectful. And so basically, there are just a couple of variations of collision rewards. If you bump another car, you get a penalty. You get a bigger penalty if you were behind the other car. We found on Circular Sarth with the much faster Red Bull competition cars, we needed even a few extra penalties. So the blue and the gray examples are penalties that were added just for that track with that car, and again discourage certain kinds of collisions more heavily. Okay, so I've described the process for training agents, and we would, before an event, we would set up a set of experiments. We'd run several. We'd set up like 5 different experiments, all the same configuration. We'd let them run, and then that would generate hundreds and hundreds of policies. So the next task is actually choosing one to enter into the race. It's like you have this vast pool of drivers with slightly different characteristics, and you got to pick one. So we had to balance things like, starting on the right, how fast is the agent? Okay. The middle is a graph of an agent's performance of a particular skill over time. How well does the agent perform these variety of skills that we tested? So are we confident it knows how to do a slipstream on both the left and the right side? Can it do a crossover pass? Things like that. And then how aggressive is it, and how much are we willing to balance the good sportsmanship versus the chance that it's going to finish in the lead? So we took all of this information in, had to pick this individual policy that was going to be in the race. So we invented this really complex process to try to narrow down the field. So we'd train a bunch of policies, then there'd be some automatic filtering, so we'd select the best ones. Then we put them through a larger number of tests to try to weed out ones that had particularly bad, particular faults that we didn't want to enter into the race. Then we would race them against each other in this thing we called the anathlon, kind of a head-to-head NVN race to see who was the strongest racer. And that would give us a much smaller set, hopefully like 4 to 6 cars. The anathlon was this large battery of tests. And then the PvP is when we race them against each other. And that ranks them. And so we come out with this ranking, and we usually would take like the top 2. And then we'd have the test drivers at Polyphony race against those. And they would give us feedback about whether these were good policies or not from a human opponent point of view. Because humans drive differently than the cars that the agents that our agents are training against. So we need the final human test to make sure that these are good policies to race against. So we did this. We had our first race set for July 2nd, 2020, I think. And we gave these policies to Polyphony. And they said, no way. If you put these policies in the race, you'd get a black flag, which means you're kicked out of the race. You can't race these against the top drivers. So we're 2 weeks away from that big event that's all scheduled, and a lot of effort has gone into setting this whole thing up. We go back, we tweak a few things, we train some more policies. They're ready like 2 days before the big event. We give them to Polyphony test drivers, and they say, OK, this is the better one, put this one in. And that's what we entered in the race. Fortunately, it passed the test of not getting thrown out of the race, so that was good. These were fast agents, but in the end, they weren't quite good enough. So we actually finished first in 2 of the 3 races. And overall, it was a pretty fair showing. The humans had 86 total points as a team. The GT Sophy agents, there are 4 of them in the race, had 70 points overall. Points are awarded by your final position, so being first at the bottom here. First is worth 10 points, and it goes 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it was close, and we were definitely in the race, but we didn't quite win. So we huddled afterwards and decided we want to try again. We want a rematch. So we set one up for October, and we spent some time investigating what were the things that the small weaknesses that GT Sophy had in that race, and could we improve on them? And there were just a few that we identified and focused on. There was one instance where GT Sophy lost control, and we investigated why that happened. The starts are actually very hard because all the cars are close together. There's usually a couple quick turns, and so you have to navigate this very dense, very chaotic beginning of a race. We talked about that one where GT Sophy gave way to Yamanaka, so we investigated why that happened. And then we were also frustrated by the fact that GT Sophy was typically over a second faster than the humans in time trial situations, but it took 4 laps for one of our agents to catch one of the humans that was only 1 second ahead of it. In theory, it should have caught up in a lap. So we looked at why all these things were happening. And so I put together some examples. The first being, this is one of the starts. This is the start of the first race on Dragon Trail Seaside. And you'll see how crowded it is, how close together the cars are, but also how Sophy wasn't able to hold its position and ended up losing significant positions here.
So Race Together 2021 is underway. It's Sophy Bordeaux that leads the field over the timing line, followed by Takuma Miyazono, followed by Sophie Violette. You can see the AI there popping into the slipstream as well as the professional drivers coming down in towards turn number 1. We go the right-handed kick, no moves being made through there, but the heavy braking zone of turn 2 could prove to be where we see moves being made. And look at Tomoaki Yamanaka having a look up the inside of Bordeaux. Bordeaux runs in a little bit wide there as Ryu has got himself up into 3rd position then ahead of Violette. Takuma Miyazono also making ground. He's up into P6 as they come down the bottom of the hill. Yamanaka having another look up the inside of Sophy Bordeaux into the right-hander, but here comes Ryu down the inside of Yamanaka. Not quite through there. Tried to make the move stick, but he was just...
So here, right off the start, all 4 humans are in 2nd to 5th place now. GT Sophy got to start in first because, like as typical, the fastest lap gets the first position, so that set the positions for the 2 teams. But all the humans were able to get past all the other GT Sophy cars before we're a quarter of the way around the track. So we wanted to figure out why that was happening and improve that. We also talked about not having the skill to hold your line and protect your driving line when you're being approached at speed from behind. So we just determined after investigating that GT Sophy Orange saw Yamanaka coming up behind it and hadn't really experienced that kind of situation in its practice because the agents it tested against weren't as good and weren't able to leverage the slipstream themselves. So when it saw a car approaching it from behind quickly, it kind of got out of the way and actually touched its brakes a little to let the other car by. Okay, so going back to the drawing board, we only had to change a few things. We took the July agents and we used them to help train better agents, and we just kept raising the bar on how good the agents we were practicing against were. We focused on improving the starts to help prepare the agent for these crazy starts against humans who did things that sometimes we hadn't seen before. We'd also gave the agent a wider variety of opponents to play against because humans tend to brake a little earlier or less precisely than the agent. And so we wanted it to be prepared for that and maybe give itself a little more room when following another car into the corner. So basically it was focus on starts, improve the training population, improve a few other places where the agent wasn't getting enough experience, and then we went back and had a rematch. I'll skip over that. So here now is the same track we just saw, Dragon Trail Seaside. Same situation, same for humans, our new October policies, and we'll see that GT Sophy is able to do much better in this one.
Second event, it's Sophy Bordeaux who will lead the field over the timing line from Ryota Kokkoman, but who will be leading when the checkered flag falls in 4 laps' time as we go racing then. So Bordeaux leads the field over the timing line, followed by Kokkoman and Violette. They're all darting into the slipstream to try and get a run on their fellow competitor. Only Bordeaux does not have the advantage then of that slipstream. Into the braking zone of turn 2 we go. It's a lunge from Kokkoman as he tries to go up the inside, but it's actually Sophie Violette who goes on the outside into turn 2. Very aggressive driving then from Violette and up into 2nd position at the end of the 1st corner. So it's now the 2 GT AIs that are in the front 2 positions of Bordeaux ahead of Violette. Then it's Kokkoman and Yamanaka, the 2 GT Pro drivers. A 2nd event, it's...
So you can see the agents were able to do much better. They not only held their position, they gained a position in that starts. And of course, that was a very short 4-lap race, and so the start was really critical to the final positions of the cars. Yeah, I also, if you have the chance to do projects where you get a British announcer, that's always so really cool. So even though we put a lot of work into the starts, this is the start of our October race on Cirque de la Sarthe, and you'll see, despite all the work, they're still very chaotic. And this is true in real racing too, so this is not unique to racing against high-end agents. This is, if you watch Formula One, a lot of the incidents happen at the very beginning of the race when all the cars are together.
And we get ready to go for the starts. Lights out and we're racing. Good start then from Takuma Miyazono. Sophy Orange immediately darts over to try and hold the charge then of Miyazono. Look at Blur then trying to attack on Yamanaka, who's managed to inherit third place in as they come towards the braking zone of turn number 2. This is a prime overtaking opportunity and there's contact there between Miyazono and Sophy Orange. That means that Yamanaka is now out in front versus Miyazono, and he's ahead is Yamanaka from... And we get...
Okay, so that was a questionable bump. In that case, I believe Miyazono was at fault, but there was no penalty handed out. And GT Sophy was knocked off the course. GT Sophy Orange was knocked off the course into the dirt and found itself instantly 7 seconds behind. However, we had also spent time trying to figure out why the agent wasn't able to catch up to cars ahead of it when it was clearly faster in the time trial situation. So it was really rewarding when we saw GT Sophy Orange catch up to the pack within 4 laps. And in this scene, we'll see in that same location where I showed you the timid behavior, Orange is able to actually execute a slipstream pass and take the lead for the first time in the race, and which it held to the end. So you can see going to the inside was a pretty bold move there. There wasn't a lot of room. And even though Yamanaka was right on GT Sophy Orange's wheels, trying to discourage it from holding that spot, it held its spot, maintained the inside to the corner, and was able to complete the pass. So we did much better in the October event. In this case, GT Sophy beat the humans by twice as many points, finished first, second, fourth, and fifth in the first 2 races, and first, second, fifth, and sixth in the last race. And definitely was both faster, a better racer, and while still being a very respectful opponent. This result allowed us to write a paper about it that appeared on the cover of the journal Nature. We go into a lot of detail about how we train the agent and the techniques that went into it. So I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to share this. But most importantly, we were able to achieve the kind of behavior that I showed you at the beginning when we saw those top GT drivers racing each other. We were able to create a scenario where the best drivers in the world are racing wheel to wheel against an agent in the game, and it feels like they're racing against the best humans available. And so this kind of head-to-head racing experience is what we were trying to accomplish. And as we go forward with the project, I'm going to skip this slide. I'll come back to it maybe. Oh, sorry. I'll go back. As we go forward with the project, the goal is to bring that kind of experience to the entire GT racing community. Here are some of the quotes from some of these top drivers who got to race against GT Sophy, either in a time trial situation where they raced the ghost of Sophy, or if they were in Japan in the actual head-to-head races. We've done several exhibitions since then at other GT esports events. We also had the opportunity to, for a limited time, have GT Sophy available for all players to race against in Gran Turismo 7. All of the prior work was done in Gran Turismo Sport, but in the intervening time, GT7 came out. And so for 6 weeks in February and March, GT Sophy was available in 4 races, 4 separate configurations for players to try and get the experience of racing against. The agent wasn't really handicapped in any way, so to give the humans a chance of keeping up if you're not the best driver in the world, then we gave them more powerful cars. And there was a beginner level and an intermediate level and an expert level where you were matched with almost the same car. And then there was the bonus level, one-on-one. All the first 3 races are all 1v4, human versus 4 different GT Sophy cars, each with a different car so that there's a mixture of performance in the race. But then there was a 1v1 configuration where you and GT Sophy had the exact same car and you got to race one-on-one around the track. And people were able to beat that, surprisingly, but only if they got to the first corner first and they held GT Sophy behind them and just drove defensively as heck through the rest of the race. And there's a lot of YouTube videos of people doing that online and talking about how intense it felt to have someone on your tail the whole race like that. So what's next? We're working with Polyphony to try to bring this to the game in a much larger and permanent sense so that GT Sophy is available to cover a lot of tracks with a lot of cars and available for a much wider range of playing skills. And before I wrap up, I was the project lead for this, but this plethora of people, this is the actual team that put this whole project together and did all the work. And so these are the AI engineers and research scientists who built the learning system and the cloud infrastructure and then the RL environments that train GT Sophy. And that's it.